The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, 5 dark shapes moving across the Montana prairie like thunder made visible. Catherine Miller pressed her face against the cracked window of the abandoned homestead she'd called home for the past 8 years, her heart hammering against her ribs as the riders drew closer. She'd been alone for so long that the sight of other human beings felt both thrilling and terrifying. The last visitors to her remote corner of the Crow Reservation had been government officials 3 years ago, come to tell her that her legal guardian was dead and that at 18 she was now officially on her own. They'd offered to relocate her to town to find her proper housing and employment. Catherine had watched them drive away in their white sedan, never to return. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, as these 5 massive figures on horseback approached her weathered cabin, Catherine realized that in 30 minutes, everything about her solitary existence was about to change forever. But what she couldn't know was that these men carried with them not just an impossible proposal, but the key to unlocking a heritage she'd never known existed and a destiny that would transform her from an isolated orphan into a bridge between 2 worlds. The story of how Catherine Miller came to be the most isolated young woman in Bighorn County began 22 years earlier, on a night when 2 worlds collided in the most unlikely way possible. Her mother, Rebecca Miller, had been a social worker from Billings who specialized in Native American family services. Idealistic and determined to make a difference, Rebecca had dedicated her life to helping indigenous families navigate the complex maze of federal bureaucracy and social services. Her father, though Catherine would never know his name, had been a Lakota man passing through Montana on his way to a gathering in Wyoming. Their brief relationship had been intense but fleeting, ending when he continued his journey west. Unaware that Rebecca was carrying his child, Rebecca Miller had been a woman of fierce independence and unwavering principles. When she discovered she was pregnant, she made the decision to raise her child alone, rather than track down a man who had made no promises and asked for none. She moved to a small rental house on the outskirts of Hardin, Montana, close enough to the reservation to continue her work but far enough from town to maintain the privacy she craved. Catherine's earliest memories were of her mother's gentle voice reading to her from books about Native American legends and histories. Rebecca had been determined that her daughter would know something of her father's heritage, even if she couldn't provide details about the man himself. The small house had been filled with art and artifacts from various tribal cultures, and Rebecca had made efforts to connect with local Crow families who might serve as cultural mentors for her daughter. But when Catherine was 6 years old, Rebecca Miller died in a car accident on a snowy December evening while returning from an emergency call to help a family in crisis. The social worker, who had dedicated her life to keeping Native American children with their families, left behind a daughter who would become lost in the very system she had spent years trying to reform. Catherine's legal guardian became her mother's older brother, James Miller, a man she had met only twice before the funeral. James was a rancher who lived in a remote area near the Wyoming border, a practical man who understood cattle and weather, but had no idea how to raise a grieving 6-year-old girl. He provided for Catherine's basic needs: food, shelter, clothing, and minimal schooling through correspondence courses, but emotional support was beyond his capabilities. The ranch where Catherine grew up was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor and 30 miles from the closest town. James Miller was not unkind, but he was deeply uncomfortable with children and even more uncomfortable with displays of emotion. He dealt with Catherine's grief and confusion by essentially leaving her to raise herself, providing supervision but little guidance or affection. As Catherine grew older, she learned to find solace in books and in the vast Montana landscape that surrounded the ranch. She became an expert at entertaining herself, developing a rich inner life that compensated for the absence of human companionship. James taught her practical skills: how to maintain the old homestead, how to garden and preserve food, how to repair equipment and manage livestock, but their conversations rarely extended beyond discussions of daily tasks. The isolation that might have broken another child became Catherine's strength. She learned to be completely self-sufficient, to find beauty and meaning in solitude, and to derive satisfaction from accomplishing difficult tasks without help or recognition. She read voraciously, ordering books through mail catalogues, and absorbing everything from classic literature to technical manuals about sustainable agriculture. When Catherine turned 14, James Miller suffered a heart attack while checking fence lines in a remote pasture. Catherine found him 3 days later, and by then it was too late for medical intervention. The man who had been her guardian for 8 years was buried in the small cemetery in Hardin, leaving behind a confused teenager who had inherited a property she couldn't legally own and responsibilities she was barely old enough to manage. The legal complications of Catherine's situation were immediately apparent to the social services officials who arrived to assess her circumstances. As a minor with no living relatives and no clear legal guardianship arrangements, she should have been placed in foster care. But the remoteness of the property and Catherine's obvious competence in managing it created a bureaucratic puzzle that no one seemed eager to solve. The temporary solution became permanent through a combination of administrative neglect and Catherine's deliberate evasion of official oversight. She learned to forge James Miller's signature on necessary documents, to handle mail and phone calls in ways that suggested adult supervision, and to avoid situations that might trigger government intervention. The property taxes were automatically deducted from James Miller's estate account, and utilities were minimal, since the homestead relied primarily on well water and solar power that James had installed years earlier. For 4 years, Catherine Miller lived in a strange legal limbo, technically a minor ward of the state, but practically an independent adult managing a remote homestead. She completed her high school education through correspondence courses, taught herself advanced skills in sustainable agriculture and renewable energy systems, and developed a modest income stream by selling organic vegetables and handmade crafts to the few tourists who occasionally passed through the area. The official notification of her majority at 18 came with the offer of assistance in transitioning to mainstream society. But Catherine had declined all services. She had spent 12 years learning to be alone, and the prospect of integrating into conventional social structures felt more threatening than appealing. The government officials had left her with contact information and warnings about the challenges of maintaining such an isolated existence, but they had also left her alone. In the 4 years since, Catherine had created a life that was both deeply satisfying and profoundly limiting. She had expanded the garden into a sophisticated permaculture system that provided most of her food needs. She had learned to maintain and repair all the equipment necessary for independent living. She had developed relationships with a few local ranchers who respected her competence and occasionally hired her for seasonal work that provided the minimal cash income she needed. But Catherine had also become increasingly aware of what she was missing. At 22, she had never been on a date, never had a close friend, never experienced the kind of emotional intimacy that most people took for granted. She had created a sustainable life, but she wasn't sure she had created a meaningful one. The loneliness had become more acute in recent months as Catherine began to question whether her self-imposed isolation was protection or prison. She found herself standing at the window more often, watching the empty horizon and wondering what lay beyond the boundaries of her carefully controlled world. She had everything she needed to survive, but she was beginning to understand that survival and living were not the same thing. The morning the 5 riders appeared, Catherine had been particularly restless. She had woken before dawn with a strange sense of anticipation, as if something significant was approaching. She had completed her morning chores efficiently but distractedly, her attention repeatedly drawn to the eastern horizon, where the sun was painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. Now, as the dust cloud resolved into 5 individual horsemen, Catherine felt a mixture of excitement and terror that left her breathless. The riders were clearly Native American, their long black hair flowing behind them as they approached. Even at a distance, she could see that they were large men, sitting their horses with the easy confidence of people who had been born to the saddle. As they drew closer, Catherine could make out more details that made her heart race even faster. These were not casual visitors or lost travelers. They rode with purpose and dignity, their horses well cared for, and their bearing suggesting some kind of official mission. The lead rider carried what appeared to be a staff decorated with feathers and beadwork, and all 5 men wore traditional clothing mixed with modern elements in a way that spoke of cultural pride rather than costume. Catherine's hands trembled as she moved away from the window to check her appearance in the old mirror that hung by the door. What she saw there was a young woman who had spent 6 years essentially hiding from the world. Her auburn hair, inherited from her mother, hung past her shoulders in a simple braid. Her skin was tanned from outdoor work, and her green eyes held an intelligence and wariness that came from years of self-reliance. She was wearing work clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that were practical but hardly appropriate for receiving what appeared to be a formal delegation. The sound of horses approaching. The cabin was unmistakable now, accompanied by the low murmur of voices speaking in a language Catherine didn't recognize, but somehow found familiar. She moved to the door, her hand hesitating on the handle as she tried to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. The knock, when it came, was firm but respectful. Catherine took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the door to face the 5 most imposing men she had ever seen. They stood in a semicircle on her small porch, their horses ground-tied behind them, and their presence seemed to fill the entire space around her cabin. The man in the center, who appeared to be their leader, was perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He held himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority, but his expression was gentle rather than intimidating. "Catherine Miller," he said in accented but clear English. "I am Thomas Crow Eagle of the Lakota Nation. These are my brothers," he gestured to the men flanking him. "We have traveled far to speak with you about a matter of great importance to our people, and, we believe, to you as well." Catherine felt her voice catch in her throat as she tried to respond. After years of minimal human contact, the simple act of conversation felt overwhelming. But there was something in Thomas Crow Eagle's manner that suggested both respect and urgency, and she forced herself to find words. "I'm Catherine," she managed to say. "I don't understand. Why have you come here? How do you even know who I am?" Thomas Crow Eagle exchanged glances with his companions before responding. "May we speak with you inside? What we have to discuss is not appropriate for your doorstep, and the journey we have made deserves proper hospitality." Something in his tone suggested that refusing would be not just rude, but potentially disastrous. Catherine stepped aside, gesturing for the 5 men to enter her small cabin. As they filed past her, she caught scents of sage and leather and horses, and she felt a strange stirring of recognition that she couldn't explain. The cabin that had felt spacious when occupied by one person suddenly seemed impossibly small, with 5 large men standing in the center of the room. Catherine gestured awkwardly toward the kitchen table and the few chairs she owned, realizing that her modest furnishings were completely inadequate for hosting such a delegation. "Please, sit wherever you can," she said, moving toward the kitchen area. "I can make coffee or tea or—" She trailed off, realizing that she had no idea what would be appropriate to offer these visitors. "Coffee would be welcome," Thomas Crow Eagle said kindly. "We have been riding since before dawn, As Catherine busied herself with preparing coffee, she became aware that the 5 men were studying her cabin with intense interest. They seemed to be cataloguing every detail, from the books that lined makeshift shelves to the Native American artwork that her mother had collected years earlier. Their examination felt thorough, but not intrusive, as if they were confirming something they had already suspected. When she returned with mugs of coffee, the men had arranged themselves around her small living space in a way that felt formal and ceremonial. Thomas Crow Eagle had taken the chair closest to where Catherine would sit, while the other 4 men had positioned themselves in what appeared to be some kind of traditional configuration. Catherine Miller. Thomas Crow Eagle began once she had settled into her chair with her own mug of coffee. What we are about to tell you may be difficult to believe, but I ask that you listen with an open heart and mind. Catherine nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly as she lifted her coffee mug. 23 years ago, your father saved the life of my youngest brother during a gathering in Wyoming. The man you knew as your father was named Joseph Standing Bear, and he was a member of our band. He died 2 years ago in an accident, but before his death, he spoke of a daughter he had left behind, a daughter whose mother had raised her alone. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. After 16 years of wondering about her father's identity, she was suddenly faced with not just his name, but with men who had known him, who had loved him, who were now sitting in her living room speaking of him as if he had been real rather than a mystery. Your father asked us to find you when the time was right, Thomas Crow Eagle continued. That time has come. Our band is facing challenges that require new leadership, new perspectives, and new alliances. We believe you may be the person we have been waiting for. Catherine felt the room spinning slightly as she tried to process what she was hearing. I don't understand. I've lived alone here for years. I don't know anything about Lakota culture or customs. How could I possibly be what you're looking for? The man to Thomas Crow Eagle's right, who had been introduced as Marcus Red Cloud, leaned forward. Sometimes the person who has learned to survive alone is exactly the person who can help others survive together. Your father spoke of your mother's strength and wisdom. He believed his daughter would inherit those qualities. But what exactly are you asking of me? Catherine asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Thomas Crow Eagle set down his coffee mug and looked directly into Catherine's eyes. We are asking you to consider joining our band as more than just a member. We are asking you to consider marriage to one of us, to become part of our leadership structure, and to help guide our people through changes that are coming, whether we are prepared for them or not. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine felt as if the entire world had shifted on its axis, leaving her struggling to maintain her balance. Marriage. To one of these men she had met 30 minutes ago. Leadership of people she had never known existed. This is impossible, she whispered. You can't be serious. We are completely serious, Thomas Crow Eagle replied. But we are not asking for an immediate answer. We are asking you to come with us, to learn about your father's people, to see if there is a place for you among us. The choice will ultimately be yours. But we believe you have a destiny that extends far beyond this isolated cabin. Catherine looked around her small home, at the life she had built through years of determination and solitude. Then she looked at the 5 men who had appeared like figures from a dream to offer her something she had never dared to imagine. A family, a purpose, and a connection to the heritage her mother had tried so hard to preserve. The woman who had been alone since childhood was being asked to step into a story larger than anything she had ever imagined. The question was whether she had the courage to say yes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation with the 5 Lakota men had ended with Catherine asking for 3 days to consider their proposal. Thomas Crow Eagle had agreed readily, explaining that such decisions required careful thought and that they would camp respectfully on the far edge of her property while she deliberated. As Catherine watched them ride toward the distant cottonwood grove, she felt as if she were seeing her solitary world through new eyes. For the first time, the life Catherine had built for herself over the past 8 years was a masterpiece of self-sufficiency that would have impressed even the most experienced homesteaders. What had begun as teenage survival had evolved into something approaching artistry, a carefully orchestrated existence where every element served multiple purposes and nothing was wasted. Her morning routine began each day at sunrise, not because she had to punch a time clock, but because she had learned that synchronizing with natural rhythms created a sense of peace and purpose that artificial schedules could never provide. Catherine would emerge from her small cabin into air that still held the coolness of night, breathing deeply as she surveyed the domain she had created through years of patient work. The garden that stretched behind her cabin represented the crown jewel of Catherine's independence. What had started as a simple vegetable plot during her teenage years had grown into a sophisticated permaculture system that provided nearly all her nutritional needs while improving the soil and supporting local wildlife. Raised beds created from salvaged lumber wound through the space in gentle curves, each one designed to capture and hold moisture while maximizing growing space. Catherine had taught herself advanced techniques through library books and agricultural extension publications, implementing companion planting strategies that turned potential pests into beneficial insects and creating polycultures that produced more food per square foot than conventional gardens. Her tomatoes grew alongside basil and marigolds, while her corn provided support for climbing beans that fixed nitrogen for the heavy-feeding squash planted. At their base, the herb spiral she had constructed near the kitchen door provided fresh seasonings year-round while demonstrating her understanding of microclimates and water management. Mediterranean herbs that preferred dry conditions occupied the sunny, well-drained upper sections, while moisture-loving plants like chives and parsley thrived in the lower, shadier areas where water naturally collected. Beyond the formal garden areas, Catherine had established food forests that mimicked natural ecosystems while producing nuts, fruits, and medicinal plants. Apple and cherry trees provided shade for understory shrubs like elderberry and serviceberry, while ground covers of wild, strawberries and mint created living mulches that suppressed weeds and provided additional harvest opportunities. Her livestock operation was equally sophisticated despite its small scale. 6 chickens provided eggs and pest control while contributing to soil fertility through their scratching and fertilizing activities. Catherine had designed a mobile chicken coop that could be moved regularly, allowing the birds to clean and fertilize different garden areas while preventing overuse of any single location. 2 goats, Nancy and Ruth, provided milk for cheese-making while serving as efficient brush clearers and companions. Catherine had built their shelter herself, designing it with proper ventilation, easy cleaning access, and integrated storage for feed and equipment. The goats' waste was composted with kitchen scraps and garden debris to create rich soil amendments that fed the entire system. Water management represented another area where Catherine's ingenuity shone. The properties well provided clean drinking water, but Catherine had also installed a rainwater collection system that captured runoff from her cabin roof and outbuildings. Carefully positioned barrels and cisterns stored thousands of gallons that could sustain her garden through the driest Montana summers. Gray water from her kitchen and bathroom was filtered through constructed wetlands that cleaned the water while providing habitat for beneficial insects and amphibians. The cleaned water then irrigated fruit trees and decorative plants, creating a closed loop that maximized the utility of every drop while minimizing environmental impact. Energy independence had been another challenge Catherine had systematically addressed. Solar panels salvaged from a failed development project provided enough electricity for basic lighting and her few electronic devices. A small wind turbine supplemented the solar array during Montana's windy seasons, while a wood-burning stove provided heat and cooking capability during winter months. Catherine had taught herself basic electrical work, plumbing and carpentry through a combination of library research, internet tutorials accessed during monthly trips to town, and careful experimentation. Her toolshed contained equipment she had accumulated through garage sales, estate auctions, and trades with neighboring ranchers who respected her competence and work ethic. The financial aspects of her independence were perhaps most impressive. Catherine's annual cash needs rarely exceeded $3,000, and she met these through a combination of strategies that demonstrated remarkable creativity and business sense. Her organic vegetables found ready markets among restaurants in Billings and Bozeman that valued locally grown produce and were willing to pay premium prices for consistently high-quality products at seasonal work during hay harvests, and carving seasons provided additional income while maintaining her connections to the broader ranching community. Catherine's reputation for reliability and competence had made her a valued temporary employee among neighboring operations that needed skilled help during peak periods. Her crafts business had evolved from simple necessity into a modest but profitable enterprise. Catherine made soaps and herbal preparations from plants she grew herself, created functional pottery using clay she dug from a deposit on her property, and wove baskets from willow shoots she harvested along the creek that bordered her land. These items sold well at farmers' markets and craft fairs, providing both income and social contact with people who appreciated handmade goods and sustainable living practices. Catherine had developed a small but loyal customer base who sought out her products for their quality and the story behind their creation. Her intellectual life was equally rich, despite its solitary nature. Catherine read voraciously, maintaining library cards in 3 different counties and making monthly expeditions to stock up on books covering everything from advanced agricultural techniques to classical literature. She had taught herself Spanish and was working on French, believing that multiple languages expanded both thinking capabilities and cultural understanding. Evening hours were often spent writing in journals that had grown to fill several shelves. Catherine documented her agricultural experiments, recorded weather patterns and their effects on various crops, and maintained detailed financial records that helped her optimize her resource allocation. But she also wrote poetry, short stories, and philosophical reflections that helped her process the complex emotions of living in such profound isolation. Music provided another dimension of enrichment. Catherine played guitar and had taught herself enough piano to work through simple classical pieces on an old upright she had acquired from a church that was upgrading their instruments. Singing while she worked had become a natural part of her daily routine, and she had developed a repertoire of folk songs, spirituals, and popular music that helped make solitary tasks more enjoyable. Physical fitness was maintained through the demands of daily work rather than formal exercise routines. Hauling water, feeding animals, working in the garden, and maintaining equipment provided all the cardiovascular and strength training anyone could need. Catherine was lean, strong, and healthy in ways that reflected genuine functional fitness rather than gymnasium aesthetics. Her relationship with the natural world had deepened over the years into something approaching mysticism. Catherine could predict weather changes by observing cloud patterns and wind shifts. She knew the seasonal movements of local wildlife and had learned to identify dozens of plant species and their traditional uses. Her garden planning was based not just on agricultural science but on lunar cycles and natural rhythms that older cultures had understood. Instinctively, winter evenings provided time for reflection and planning that kept Catherine connected to purposes larger than immediate survival. She studied permaculture design principles, researched renewable energy technologies, and dreamed of ways her small homestead might serve as a model for sustainable living practices that could benefit others. Despite the richness of her solitary existence, Catherine was honest enough with herself to recognize its limitations. She had created a life of remarkable self-sufficiency and genuine satisfaction, but she had also created a prison of sorts. Her competence and independence were real achievements, but they had come at the cost of emotional intimacy and social connection that no amount of personal accomplishment could replace. The absence of romantic relationships was perhaps the most obvious gap in Catherine's otherwise fulfilling existence. At 22, she had never experienced the vulnerability and joy of falling in love, never learned to navigate the complexities of partnership, never had to balance her fierce independence with the compromises that intimate relationships required. But the isolation ran deeper than romantic loneliness. Catherine had no close friends, no mentors beyond the books she read, no community of peers who shared her interests and challenges. The neighboring ranchers who respected her work ethic maintained friendly but distant relationships that rarely extended beyond professional interactions. The customers who bought her crafts appreciated her products but knew nothing of her personal struggles or dreams. Family connections were non-existent beyond the legal formalities that had defined her relationship with James Miller. Catherine had no aunts or uncles, no cousins or grandparents, no network of relatives who might provide emotional support or cultural continuity. The holidays she observed were solitary affairs marked by special meals and small rituals she had created for herself. Cultural identity represented another complex absence in Catherine's life. Her mother's efforts to preserve connections to her father's heritage had been well-intentioned, but necessarily limited. The Native American artifacts and books that decorated Catherine's cabin were meaningful symbols, but they could not provide the lived experience of cultural participation that would have come from community membership. Catherine had often wondered about her father's people, imagining what it might be like to belong to a community with shared traditions and collective memory. She had researched Lakota history and culture extensively, but academic knowledge was different from the embodied understanding that came from being raised within a cultural tradition. The arrival of Thomas Crow Eagle and his companions had suddenly made abstract questions about heritage and belonging urgently concrete. These men claimed connection to her father and offered entry into a world she had only imagined. But they were also asking her to leave behind everything she had built, everything that had given her life meaning and purpose for the past 8 years. As Catherine walked through her garden that first evening after the delegation's arrival, she found herself seeing each carefully tended bed as both achievement and limitation. The tomatoes she had nurtured from seeds represented months of patient work and intimate knowledge of plant needs. But they also represented a commitment to staying in one place, to maintaining systems that required constant attention and care. The goats that provided milk and companionship also required daily feeding and seasonal breeding management. The solar panels that provided energy independence also represented thousands of dollars in investment that would be lost if she left. The customer relationships that supported her craft business also represented commitments that could not easily be transferred to someone else. Most fundamentally, the identity Catherine had constructed as an independent, self-sufficient homesteader was deeply intertwined with the physical place she had created. She was not just Catherine Miller, who happened to live on a Montana homestead. She was Catherine Miller, whose competence and worth were proven by her ability to thrive in isolation, to create abundance through intelligence and determination, to need no one and nothing beyond her own resources. The thought of leaving this carefully constructed life to join a community where she would be dependent on others, where her value would be determined by her ability to contribute to collective rather than individual goals, felt both thrilling and terrifying. Everything she had learned about herself was based on solitary achievement. She had no idea who she might become as part of a group, as someone's wife. As a member of a community with expectations and traditions, she barely understood. But as Catherine completed her evening chores and prepared for what she knew would be a sleepless night of deliberation, she also felt stirrings of excitement that had been absent from her life for years. The perfect existence she had created was also a perfect trap, beautiful and sustainable, but ultimately limiting in its very completeness. The 5 men camped by the cottonwood grove represented more than just an impossible proposal. They represented the possibility of growth beyond the boundaries she had established for herself, the chance to discover capacities and connections that solitary life could never provide. The woman who had mastered the art of living alone was being invited to learn the infinitely more complex art of living with others. Standing at her cabin window as darkness settled over the prairie, Catherine could see the distant glow of the Lakota campfire. Tomorrow would bring another day of consideration, another 24 hours to weigh everything she had built against everything she might become. The perfect life she had created was about to be tested by the possibility of an imperfect but infinitely more complex future. The first night after the delegation's arrival, Catherine didn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to sounds she had never heard before on her property, the low murmur of voices carrying across the darkness, the occasional whinny of horses, the crackle of a campfire that wasn't her own. For 8 years, she had been the only human presence for miles. Now 5 strangers were camped within sight of her cabin, and their presence had transformed her familiar landscape into something foreign and electric with possibility. By dawn, Catherine had made a decision that surprised her. Instead of spending the 3 days in isolated contemplation as she had originally planned, she would use the time to learn everything she could about these men and what they were truly offering. If she was going to uproot her entire existence, she needed to understand exactly what she would be stepping into. After completing her morning chores with unusual haste, Catherine walked across the dew-dampened prairie toward the cottonwood grove, where smoke was already rising from the Lakota camp. As she approached, she could see that the 5 men had established a remarkably organized temporary settlement. Their horses grazed peacefully in a rope corral, while equipment and supplies were arranged with military precision around a central fire pit. Thomas Crow Eagle emerged from what appeared to be a traditional teepee that Catherine hadn't noticed. In the fading light of the previous evening, he was dressed in jeans and a work shirt, but his long hair was braided with beaded ties that caught the morning sunlight. His greeting was warm but unsurprised, as if he had been expecting her visit. "Catherine Miller," he said, offering her a cup of coffee that smelled considerably better than what she typically brewed for herself. "You are welcome in our camp. We hoped you might join us for breakfast and conversation." The other 4 men emerged from their own shelters as Catherine accepted the coffee. In daylight, she could see them more clearly as individuals rather than an imposing collective presence. Marcus Red Cloud, who had spoken the previous day about surviving alone and surviving together, appeared to be in his early 30s with laugh lines around his eyes and calloused hands that spoke of physical work. David Tallbear was perhaps the youngest, closer to Catherine's own age, with an easy smile and the lean build of someone who spent considerable time on horseback. Samuel Whitehawk looked to be in his late 30s, with silver at his temples and a bearing that suggested both intelligence and authority. The 5th man, introduced as Michael Thunderhorse, was massive even by the standards of his companions, well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed designed for carrying heavy burdens. His demeanor was gentle despite his intimidating size, and Catherine noticed that the horses seemed particularly calm in his presence. "Tell me about your father," Catherine said without preamble as they settled around the fire with plates of food that had been prepared with obvious skill. "Tell me who Joseph Standing Bear really was," The request seemed to please Thomas Crow Eagle, who exchanged glances with his companions before beginning a story that would fundamentally alter Catherine's understanding of her own identity. "Your father was what we call a bridge walker," Thomas began, his voice taking on the cadence of formal storytelling. He could move between the traditional world and the contemporary world without losing his footing in either. This made him valuable to our people, but it also made his life complicated. Joseph Standing Bear, Catherine learned, had been born on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, but had left as a young man to pursue education in the outside world. He had earned degrees in both engineering and law, skills that he brought back to serve various Native American communities throughout the region. His work involved everything from negotiating water rights to designing renewable energy systems for remote tribal settlements. "He was traveling to a conference in Wyoming when he met your mother," Marcus Red Cloud continued. "The gathering was about sustainable development on tribal lands, and your mother was there representing social services agencies that worked with indigenous families. They found each other because they were both trying to build bridges between worlds that often seemed incompatible," David Tallbear added. Details that painted a picture of a brief but intense relationship between two people who shared values and vision but lived in different realities. "Your father spoke of your mother many times over the years. He respected her decision to raise you alone, but he always regretted not knowing you. When he learned he was dying, finding you became his priority. The story that emerged revealed a man who had spent his life serving others while struggling with his own sense of belonging. Joseph Standing Bear had never married, never had other children, never found a way to balance his public responsibilities with personal happiness. His dying request to his closest friends had been specific and urgent. Find his daughter, learn what kind of woman she had become, and determine whether she might be the bridge their own community desperately needed." "What kind of bridge?" Catherine asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complex than she was prepared to handle. Samuel Whitehawk leaned forward, his expression serious. "Our band faces challenges that traditional leadership structures cannot solve alone. We are caught between preserving our cultural identity and adapting to economic realities that threaten our survival. We need someone who understands both worlds well enough to help us navigate the space between them." The explanation that followed revealed a community in crisis. The Lakota band these men represented consisted of about 200 people living on a remote section of the Pine Ridge Reservation that had been largely forgotten by both federal authorities and tribal government. They had maintained traditional practices and language more successfully than many communities, but this cultural preservation had come at the cost of economic development and political influence. Federal funding for social services, education, and infrastructure had been steadily reduced over the past decade. Young people were leaving for cities because the reservation offered few employment opportunities. Traditional skills and knowledge were being lost as elders died without finding young people interested in learning from them. "We have land, but we cannot develop it effectively without compromising our values," Michael Thunderhorse explained, in a voice that carried surprising gentleness for such a large man. "We have cultural knowledge, but we cannot preserve it without economic stability. We have unity, but we cannot maintain it without hope for the future." Catherine found herself fascinated by the complexity of their situation. These were not people seeking charity or sympathy, but rather intelligent, capable individuals who recognized that their current strategies were insufficient for the challenges they faced. They needed innovation, but innovation that honored rather than abandoned their cultural foundations. "You still haven't explained why you think I might be able to help," Catherine pointed out. "I know nothing about tribal politics or economic development. I've never even been part of a community, let alone led one." Thomas Crow Eagle smiled at her directness. "Your father believed that someone who had learned to thrive in isolation would understand both the value of self-sufficiency and the limitations of trying to survive alone. You have created abundance through your own intelligence and work. Now imagine what might be possible if those same skills were applied. To the benefit of an entire community, the conversation continued throughout the morning as the five men took turns describing their community's resources, challenges, and dreams. Catherine learned about traditional agricultural practices that could be enhanced with permaculture techniques she had mastered. She heard about renewable energy projects that were stalled due to lack of technical expertise. She discovered cultural preservation, efforts that could benefit from the documentation and organizational skills she had developed through years of managing her homestead, but she also learned about the personal costs of leadership, the complex family dynamics that shaped tribal politics, and the constant pressure of representing not just individual interests, but the hopes and fears of an entire community. The men were honest about their own failures and limitations, describing previous efforts that had fallen short and acknowledging the risks inherent in bringing an outsider into their leadership structure. The marriage proposal, Catherine said during a pause in the conversation. Is that a political necessity or a personal choice? The question created a moment of silence that felt charged with significance. Finally, David Tallbear answered with a directness that matched her own. For our community, marriage represents more than personal relationship. A leader's spouse becomes part of the decision-making structure, gains standing to speak in council, and becomes responsible for certain aspects of community welfare. Without marriage, you could live among us and contribute your skills, but you could not become the bridge we need. Marcus Red Cloud added, but the choice of partner would be yours. We five have committed to this mission because we each believe we could build a successful marriage with you. But we are not asking you to choose blindly. We are asking you to come with us, learn about our community and about each of us as individuals, and then decide whether any of us might become a true partner in both personal and community leadership. The afternoon brought practical demonstrations that revealed the depth of preparation behind the delegation's visit. Samuel Whitehawk produced detailed maps showing the band's territory, resource inventories, and development plans that had been created but never implemented due to lack of technical expertise. Michael Thunderhorse demonstrated traditional horse training techniques while explaining how they were developing sustainable livestock operations that could provide both cultural connection and economic opportunity. David Tallbear showed Catherine photographs of the community's children, explaining educational challenges that closely paralleled issues she had wrestled with during her own correspondence school years. The lack of culturally relevant curriculum, the difficulty of maintaining traditional knowledge alongside contemporary academic requirements, and the absence of role models who had successfully integrated both worlds were problems she understood intimately. Marcus Red Cloud described renewable energy projects that had been planned for years, but never implemented because no one in the community had the technical knowledge to install and maintain solar and wind systems. As he spoke, Catherine realized that her hard-won expertise in off-grid living represented exactly the skills their community needed to achieve energy independence, but it was Thomas Crow Eagle who presented the most compelling vision for what Catherine's role might become. He spoke of establishing a demonstration center that would showcase sustainable living practices adaptable to reservation conditions. Traditional agricultural techniques, enhanced with permaculture principles, could be taught to other communities facing similar challenges. Renewable energy installations could serve as models for tribal communities throughout the region. Your homestead proves that it is possible to live well without dependence on outside systems, Thomas explained. But imagine scaling those principles to serve 200 people instead of one. Imagine creating a community that could be genuinely self-sufficient while maintaining cultural traditions and values. As evening approached, Catherine found herself more intrigued than she had expected to be. The challenges these men described were complex and daunting, but they were also exactly the kind of problems that had energized her throughout her years of homestead development. She had always been motivated by the puzzle of making systems work better, of finding solutions that served multiple purposes simultaneously. But the personal dimensions of their proposal remained overwhelming. Catherine had never shared her living space with another person, let alone committed to marriage with someone she barely knew. The thought of intimate relationship with any of these men felt both thrilling and terrifying in ways she couldn't adequately process. "I need to understand something," Catherine said as they prepared to return to their respective camps for the night. "This marriage arrangement, how would it work practically? Are you asking me to choose based on 3 days of conversation? Are you expecting love or partnership or something else entirely?" The 5 men exchanged glances before Thomas Crow Eagle answered carefully. "Traditional marriages in our culture were often arranged based on compatibility, family alliances, and community needs rather than romantic love. Love could grow from shared work and mutual respect, but it was not considered the primary foundation for marriage. However," Samuel Whitehawk added, "we understand that your upbringing was different. We would not ask you to enter a marriage without genuine affection and respect for your chosen partner. The courtship period would allow you to determine whether such feelings might develop." David Tallbear smiled as he contributed, "We are not asking you to marry a stranger. We are asking you to consider whether one of us might become someone you could love, and whether you might become someone we could love in return." As Catherine walked back to her cabin, under a sky brilliant with stars, she felt as if her brain were operating at maximum capacity, trying to process everything she had learned. These were not desperate men seeking any solution to their problems, but rather thoughtful leaders who had spent considerable time and energy developing a strategy that might serve both their community's needs and her own potential for growth. The proposal was audacious in its scope and implications, but it was also carefully planned and realistically grounded. They weren't asking her to abandon her skills and knowledge, but rather to apply them in service of something larger than individual survival. They weren't demanding immediate commitment, but rather offering a process that would allow all parties to make informed decisions. Most importantly, they were offering her something she had never dared to hope for, the chance to belong to something meaningful while remaining true to the competence and independence that defined her identity. The woman who had mastered the art of living alone was being invited to help create a community where others could thrive as well. But Catherine also recognized that accepting their proposal would mean leaving behind everything familiar and comfortable for a future that was completely uncertain. The perfect life she had created would become a foundation for something infinitely more complex and potentially more rewarding, but also more likely to fail in ways that would affect not just her own well-being, but the hopes and dreams of an entire community. The second day of deliberation had raised more questions than it had answered. But Catherine felt closer to understanding what choice she was actually being asked to make. The catalyst had been introduced, and the rising tension was no longer just about personal decision-making, but about the possibility of transformation that could extend far beyond her own existence. The second night brought a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the turbulence in Catherine's mind. She stood at her kitchen window watching lightning illuminate the Lakota camp, wondering if the men were dry in their shelters and surprised by how much she cared about their comfort. That concern, she realized, was itself a sign of how profoundly the past 2 days had already changed her. The third day dawned clear and unusually warm for September, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Catherine woke with the strange certainty that this would be the day everything changed, regardless of what decision she made. The life she had built with such careful precision over the past 8 years felt suddenly fragile, as if it existed in a bubble that could burst at any moment. She completed her morning chores with unusual attention to detail, as if she were memorizing each task. Feeding the chickens, milking the goats, checking the garden for ripe vegetables, activities that had become so routine they required no conscious thought suddenly felt precious and finite. By the time she finished, Catherine knew with startling clarity what her answer would be. The walk to the Lakota camp felt longer than it had the previous 2 days, each step carrying her further from the security of everything familiar. Thomas Crow Eagle was waiting for her beside the fire, his expression patient but alert. The other 4 men emerged from their morning activities as she approached, forming the same respectful semicircle that had characterized their first meeting. "I have made my decision," Catherine said without preamble, her voice steadier than she felt.
"I will come with you."
"But I have conditions." The relief that flickered across Thomas Crow Eagle's face was quickly replaced by attentive seriousness. "We would expect nothing less." "What conditions?" Catherine had spent hours formulating her requirements, trying to balance her need for security with the reality of what she was proposing to do. "First, I want a trial period. 6 months to learn about your community and determine if this arrangement can work for everyone involved. If either side decides it's not working, I should be free to return here without penalty or hard feelings." "Agreed," Thomas replied immediately. "What else?" "Second, if I do marry one of you, I want it understood that I'm not just acquiring a husband. I'm entering a partnership where my opinions and expertise are valued. I won't be a decorative addition to your leadership structure." Samuel Whitehawk spoke up. "The role we envision for you would require exactly that kind of partnership. A community leader who couldn't speak her mind or contribute her knowledge would be useless to us." Catherine nodded, encouraged by his directness. "Third, I want to maintain some connection to this place. It represents 8 years of my life and work. I'm not asking to come back every month, but I don't want to burn all bridges behind me. Your homestead will remain yours," Marcus Redcloud assured her. "We understand that you might need to return periodically, both for practical reasons and for your own peace of mind." The 4th condition was the most difficult to articulate. "I need time to get to know each of you as individuals before making any decisions about marriage. I won't choose a husband based on 3 days of conversation, and I won't marry someone just because your community needs a leader's wife." David Tallbear smiled at this. "We would be disappointed if you approach such an important decision any other way. The courtship period exists precisely so that genuine affection and respect can develop," Michael Thunderhorse, who had been silent until this point, added quietly. "A marriage based on duty alone would serve neither you nor our community well. We want partners, not obligations." The final condition felt almost presumptuous to voice, but Catherine knew it was essential. "If this doesn't work out, if I can't adapt to community life, or if none of you turn out to be someone I could marry, I want assurance that my participation won't be seen as failure or betrayal. Sometimes things just don't work, and I need to know that everyone understands that possibility." Thomas Crow Eagle considered this carefully before responding. "Your father's greatest gift to us was his honesty about what was possible and what wasn't. We would expect the same honesty from you, including the honesty to say if this arrangement cannot serve everyone's needs, with her conditions accepted." Catherine felt the last barriers to her decision dissolving. "Then yes, I'll come with you." "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Thomas replied. "That will give you today to make arrangements and prepare for an extended absence." The practical aspects of leaving proved more complex than Catherine had anticipated. Her livestock needed care, her garden required maintenance, and her various business relationships needed notification. The men offered to help with preparations, and Catherine found herself grateful for assistance she had never needed before. David Tallbear proved surprisingly knowledgeable about chicken care, helping Catherine construct an automated feeding system that would keep her birds fed for several weeks. Samuel Whitehawk worked with her to install additional rainwater collection capacity that would keep her garden irrigated through autumn. Marcus Redcloud helped her preserve the last of her summer harvest, while Michael Thunderhorse reinforced her goat shelter against winter weather. Thomas Crow Eagle, focused on helping Catherine sort through her possessions, determining what to take, what to leave, and what to arrange for long-term storage. The process forced her to confront how much stuff she had accumulated during her years of self-sufficient living, and how little of it was truly essential. Take tools, Thomas advised as they packed. Take books and anything that represents knowledge you might need. Take clothing and personal items that will help you feel at home in new surroundings. But don't try to recreate your entire homestead in our community. Part of this experience is learning to live differently. As the day progressed, Catherine found herself observing the 5 men more carefully as individuals rather than as a collective delegation. Their willingness to help with her preparations revealed aspects of their personalities that formal conversation had not shown. David Tallbear approached every task with enthusiasm and curiosity, asking questions about her systems and techniques that showed genuine interest in learning. He was clearly someone who enjoyed solving problems and improving processes, qualities that Catherine found appealing in a potential partner. Samuel Whitehawk worked with quiet efficiency, understanding her needs almost before she articulated them, and completing tasks with minimal direction. His competence was impressive, but Catherine wondered if his self-sufficiency might make partnership difficult. She appreciated independence, but she also wanted someone who would need her as much as she needed them. Marcus Red Cloud brought humor and conversation to every activity, turning work into social interaction in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Catherine, who had spent years working in solitude, found his companionship surprisingly enjoyable. But she also wondered if someone so socially oriented would understand her need for occasional privacy and reflection. Michael Thunder. Horse approached each task with careful attention to detail and obvious consideration for her feelings about leaving familiar surroundings. His gentleness was touching, but Catherine worried that his deference might indicate passivity rather than respect. She needed a partner who would challenge her thinking, not just agree with her decisions. Thomas Crow Eagle revealed himself to be an excellent organizer and planner, but Catherine noticed that he tended to take charge of situations automatically. His leadership qualities were evident, but she wondered how he would handle sharing authority with a wife who had strong opinions and considerable expertise of her own. By evening, Catherine's cabin looked strange and empty despite her efforts to take only essential items. The spaces where her most important possessions had been created gaps that made familiar surroundings feel abandoned and forlorn. She stood in her kitchen looking at the empty shelves and bare counters, trying to memorize the place that had been her entire world for so many years. The men had returned to their camp after helping with preparations, giving Catherine privacy for her final night in the homestead. She had expected to feel sadness or regret, but instead found herself experiencing anticipation mixed with terror in proportions that kept shifting throughout the evening. She walked through her garden one last time, checking the automatic watering systems and noting which plants would be ready for harvest when she returned, if she returned. The thought brought a stab of anxiety that surprised her with its intensity. Despite all her preparations and planning, part of her suspected that leaving this place would mean never truly coming back, that the woman who returned in 6 months would be so changed that the homestead would no longer feel like home. That night, Catherine wrote letters to her few business contacts and neighbors, explaining her temporary absence without providing details about her destination or purpose. She arranged for her closest neighbor, a rancher named Bill Patterson, to check on her property periodically and handle any emergencies that might arise. She also wrote a letter to herself, describing her current feelings, motivations, and fears. The letter would remain in her cabin, a record of who she had been at the moment of leaving that might help her understand how much she had changed when she eventually returned. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams that mixed memories of her solitary years with imagined scenes of community life. Catherine woke repeatedly, each time momentarily forgetting that this was her last night alone before embarking on the most significant adventure of her life. Dawn brought a crispness that suggested autumn's approach and the end of growing season. Catherine completed her final chores with mechanical precision, her mind already focused on the journey ahead. The chickens seemed oblivious to the automated feeding system that would sustain them, while the goats watched her with expressions that suggested they understood something significant was happening. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the delegation for the last time. Catherine shouldered her pack, took one final look around the cabin that had been her sanctuary and prison, and walked outside to meet her future. The 5 men sat their horses with the same dignity they had displayed during their arrival 4 days earlier. But now Catherine saw them as potential partners rather than intimidating strangers. One of these men might become her husband, her collaborator in building something larger than either of them could create alone. Thomas Crow Eagle dismounted to help her secure her belongings to a pack horse they had brought for her use. "Any second thoughts?" he asked quietly. Catherine looked back at her homestead one final time, seeing it now as the foundation for everything that would come next, rather than the end point of her ambitions. "None," she replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Mounting the horse they had provided, Catherine felt the peculiar sensation of leaving her feet on the ground for what might be the last time in months. The animal was gentle and well-trained, responding to her inexperienced guidance with patience that suggested careful selection for this particular journey. As they rode away from the homestead, Catherine resisted the urge to look back. The point of no return had been reached and passed. The woman who had been alone since childhood was riding toward a future that would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about relationships, and about what it meant to belong to something larger than individual survival. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie as the small cavalcade headed toward horizons Catherine had never explored. Behind them, the homestead grew smaller until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the vast Montana landscape and the promise of transformation that lay somewhere beyond the eastern hills. The greatest adventure of Catherine Miller's life had begun, carrying her away from everything certain toward everything possible. The point of no return was now behind her, and ahead lay either the fulfillment of dreams she had never dared to voice, or the kind of failure that would require rebuilding her entire sense of self. But for the first time in her adult life, Catherine was not facing the future alone. The first hour of riding passed in relative silence as Catherine focused on staying balanced on her horse while processing the magnitude of what she had just done. The animal beneath her, a sturdy mare named Whisper, moved with a gentle rolling gait that gradually relaxed Catherine's death grip on the reins. Behind her, the familiar landmarks of her territory disappeared one by one until she was riding through country she had never seen before. The landscape itself seemed to shift as they traveled east, the isolated ranching country giving way to broader vistas and different vegetation. Catherine found herself studying the terrain with new eyes, comparing the soil conditions and plant communities to what she knew from her homestead. This observer's mindset helped distract her from the growing anxiety about where exactly they were headed and what she would find when they arrived. "The reservation is still 2 days' ride," Thomas Crow Eagle explained during their first rest stop. "We'll camp tonight at a place my grandfather used to call Eagle's Rest, near a spring that has never gone dry. Tomorrow we'll reach the edge of our territory, and you'll begin to see how we live." Catherine appreciated the information, but she was more interested in observing how the 5 men interacted when they weren't focused on convincing her to join them. Away from the formal atmosphere of negotiations, their individual personalities emerged more clearly through casual conversation and shared tasks. David Tallbear proved to be the group's natural entertainer, telling stories and making observations that kept everyone's spirits up during the long stretches of riding. His humor wasn't forced or attention-seeking, but rather the kind of genuine warmth that made difficult situations more bearable. Catherine found herself relaxing in his presence, smiling at his commentary about the landscapes they passed and the wildlife they encountered. Samuel Whitehawk revealed himself to be the practical organizer, anticipating needs before they became problems, and handling logistics with quiet efficiency. He seemed to know exactly when to call rest stops, where to find the best routes through difficult terrain, and how to manage their supplies to ensure everyone stayed comfortable and well-fed. Catherine admired his competence, but wondered if his self-sufficiency might make him emotionally distant as well. Marcus Redcloud appointed himself Catherine's informal riding instructor, offering tips about posture and communication with her horse that made the journey significantly more comfortable. His teaching style was patient and encouraging, and Catherine appreciated how he managed to boost her confidence without making her feel incompetent. She began to see qualities in him that would make him a supportive partner for someone learning to navigate new challenges. Michael Thunder. Horse rode with the quiet awareness of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He noticed details that others missed: weather changes, animal tracks, subtle shifts in terrain that might affect their route. His observations were offered quietly, but proved consistently valuable. Catherine found his deep knowledge of the natural world appealing, recognizing a kindred spirit who found meaning in close attention to environmental details. Thomas Crow Eagle maintained his role as expedition leader, but Catherine noticed that he consulted with the others before making decisions and seemed genuinely interested in ensuring everyone's comfort and safety. His leadership style was inclusive rather than authoritative, which surprised Catherine, given his formal bearing during their initial negotiations. The first evening's camp at Eagle's Rest revealed another dimension of the group's dynamics. The spring Thomas had mentioned emerged from a rock formation that created a natural amphitheater, with clear water flowing into a series of pools surrounded by cottonwood trees. The location was so beautiful that Catherine understood immediately why it held significance for Thomas's grandfather. Setting up camp became a collaborative effort that followed patterns clearly established through years of traveling together. Each man had specific responsibilities, but they also helped each other and accommodated Catherine's inexperience with camping equipment and outdoor cooking. The efficiency of their cooperation impressed her, suggesting a level of mutual respect and shared purpose that boded well for their community's leadership structure. Setting up camp became a collaborative effort that followed patterns clearly established through years of traveling together. Each man had specific responsibilities, but they also helped each other and accommodated Catherine's inexperience with camping equipment and outdoor cooking. The efficiency of their cooperation impressed her, suggesting a level of mutual respect and shared purpose that boded well for their community's leadership structure. Dinner was simple but delicious: fresh trout that David had caught during their afternoon stop, combined with vegetables and flatbread that had been packed for the journey. Catherine contributed wild greens she had recognized along their route, demonstrating knowledge that clearly pleased her companions. The meal felt like a small celebration of successful collaboration. As darkness settled around their fire, the conversation turned to stories and traditions that helped Catherine understand more about the culture she was considering joining. Thomas shared legends about the spring where they were camped, while Marcus explained the significance of various constellations that were becoming visible in the clear night sky. "Our people have always been travelers," Samuel observed as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "We followed the buffalo herds, followed the seasons, followed opportunities for trade and alliance. What you're doing now, leaving familiar territory to explore new possibilities, is very much in keeping with our traditions." Catherine found this perspective comforting. She had been thinking of her decision as abandonment of everything she valued. But Samuel's words suggested It might instead be fulfillment of heritage she had never known she possessed. David produced a small wooden flute and played melodies that seemed to blend with the sounds of night birds and flowing water. The music was unlike anything Catherine had heard before, not quite sorrowful, but deeply emotional, speaking of longing and connection in ways that words couldn't capture. "That's beautiful," Catherine said when David finished a particularly haunting piece. "Is it traditional music?" "Some traditional, some contemporary," David replied. "Music evolves just like everything else, but the heart of it remains the same. It's about expressing feelings that are too big for ordinary conversation." The comment resonated with Catherine, who had spent years experiencing emotions in isolation that she had never been able to share with another person. The idea of music as a form of communication beyond words appealed to her in ways she was just beginning to understand. Michael Thunderhorse contributed his own form of entertainment by demonstrating rope tricks and sharing knowledge about horse behavior that fascinated Catherine. His gentle way with animals reminded her of her own relationship with her goats and chickens, suggesting shared values about the treatment of creatures under human care. As the evening progressed, Catherine realized she was experiencing something completely new in her adult life: the pleasure of belonging to a group without having to prove her worth or defend her choices. These men seemed to accept her presence as natural and valuable, neither demanding constant entertainment nor treating her like a burden to be accommodated. The sleeping arrangements had been carefully planned to respect her privacy while maintaining safety and warmth. Catherine's bedroll was positioned near the fire, but screened by a strategically placed tarp that provided privacy for changing clothes and personal care. The consideration for her comfort and dignity impressed her, suggesting thoughtfulness about her needs that extended beyond the formal courtship process. Despite her exhaustion from the day's riding, Catherine found sleep elusive. Every sound in the darkness seemed amplified: the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the splash of water over rocks, the occasional snort from the picketed horses. But rather than feeling threatened by the unfamiliar environment, she felt strangely energized by the richness of sensory input after years of solitary evenings in her quiet cabin. When she finally dozed, Catherine's dreams were filled with movement: horses and riders crossing vast landscapes, rivers that flowed toward unknown destinations, paths that diverged in multiple directions through country she had never seen. She woke several times feeling disoriented but excited, as if her unconscious mind were already adapting to the possibilities that lay ahead. The second day of travel brought more challenging terrain as they entered the Badlands region that bordered the reservation. The landscape became more dramatic, with eroded formations creating natural sculptures and hidden valleys that seemed to appear suddenly as they crested ridges. Catherine found the scenery spectacular, but also somewhat intimidating in its scale and wildness. "This country teaches humility," Thomas observed as they paused to rest the horses on a ridge overlooking a maze of canyons and rock formations. "It's beautiful, but it doesn't forgive carelessness or arrogance. Our ancestors learned to live in harmony with places like this because they understood that the land was more powerful than they were." Catherine understood exactly what he meant. Her homestead had taught her similar lessons about respecting natural systems and working within environmental constraints rather than fighting against them. But the Badlands represented those principles on a much grander scale, demanding not just adaptation, but genuine humility in the face of forces beyond human control. The riding became more technically demanding as they navigated narrow trails and steep descents. Catherine's inexperience became more apparent, but her companions adjusted their pace and offered assistance without making her feel incompetent. Marcus continued his informal riding lessons, while Michael kept a protective eye on her horse's footing, and David provided encouragement during particularly challenging sections. By afternoon, they reached what Thomas identified as the boundary of their band's territory. Catherine had expected some kind of marker or sign, But the transition was marked only by subtle changes in how her companions carried themselves. They sat straighter in their saddles, spoke more quietly, and seemed more alert to their surroundings. "From here on, we're responsible for your safety in ways that go beyond the normal duties of hospitality," Samuel explained. "You're under our protection now, and our community will judge us by how well we care for you." The weight of that responsibility was evident in how the men positioned themselves around Catherine as they continued riding. She was no longer just a guest on a journey, but someone whose welfare reflected on their honor and competence. The shift felt both protective and slightly overwhelming. Late in the afternoon, they topped a rise that provided the first view of the Lakota community Catherine might be joining. The settlement sprawled across a valley floor beside a meandering river, with traditional teepees mixed among more conventional houses, and several larger buildings that appeared to serve community functions. Smoke rose from cooking fires and chimneys, while horses grazed in enclosed pastures and children played in open areas between dwellings. The scene looked both foreign and surprisingly familiar to Catherine, who recognized the same patterns of organization and land use that characterize successful rural communities everywhere. But she also noticed differences that spoke of cultural values distinct from mainstream American society, the integration of traditional and contemporary housing, the apparent absence of fences dividing individual properties, and the number of people visible outside their homes engaged in communal activities. "It's bigger than I expected," Catherine said, studying the layout of buildings and trying to estimate the population. "About 200 people, Marcus confirmed. "Large enough to maintain our traditions and small enough that everyone knows everyone else. You'll find that privacy works differently here than what you're used to in your isolated homestead." As they descended toward the settlement, Catherine became aware of being observed. People emerged from buildings and stopped their activities to watch the returning delegation. She felt suddenly self-conscious about her appearance and behavior, realizing that her first impression on this community would affect her ability to integrate successfully. "Remember," Thomas said quietly as they approached the first dwellings, "you're here to learn and explore, not to prove yourself immediately. People will be curious about you, but they'll also be respectful of your need to find your place gradually." The reassurance helped, but Catherine still felt her heart racing as they rode into the heart of a community unlike anything she had ever experienced. Children ran alongside their horses, calling greetings to the men and staring openly at Catherine with the unguarded curiosity of youth. Adults waved and called out questions in both English and what Catherine assumed was Lakota, creating a welcoming but overwhelming atmosphere. They stopped in front of a large log building that appeared to serve as a community center or meeting hall. An elderly woman emerged from the structure, moving with the dignity and authority of someone accustomed to respect. Her gray hair was braided with beaded ties, and she wore a mixture of traditional and contemporary clothing that somehow looked perfectly natural. "Grandmother standing bare," Thomas said, dismounting and approaching the woman with obvious affection and respect. "We have returned with Joseph's daughter." Catherine felt a shock of recognition at the name, realizing that this woman must be her father's mother, her own grandmother, the first blood relative she had met since her mother's death 16 years earlier. The enormity of the moment left her speechless as she struggled to dismount from her horse with something approaching grace. Grandmother standing bare studied Catherine with eyes that seemed to see everything, taking in details of appearance, bearing, and character with the intensity of someone making crucial assessments. Finally, she stepped forward and placed gentle hands on Catherine's face, speaking words in Lakota that required no translation. "Welcome home, granddaughter," she said in accented but clear English. "We have been waiting for you for a very long time." The simple words hit Catherine with unexpected emotional force. After 16 years of believing herself completely alone in the world, she was suddenly surrounded by people who claimed connection to her, who had been anticipating her arrival, who called this place home and suggested she might belong here as well. Standing in the center of a Lakota community with her father's mother's hands still touching her face, Catherine realized that the wilderness she had entered was not just geographical, but emotional and cultural. Everything familiar had been left behind, and ahead lay the challenge of discovering whether she could truly become part of something larger than herself. The woman who had mastered the art of living alone was about to learn whether she could master the infinitely more complex art of belonging to a community where her individual survival was less important than the collective welfare of 200 people who were now watching her with curiosity, hope, and expectation. Catherine's first week in the Lakota community challenged every assumption she had developed about privacy, independence, and social interaction during her years of solitary living. The simple act of walking from her temporary quarters to the communal dining area required navigating conversations with a dozen people who seemed genuinely interested in her daily activities, her opinions about the weather, and her adjustment to community life. Grandmother Standing Bear had arranged for Catherine to stay in a small cabin adjacent to her own home, explaining that this proximity would allow for informal mentoring while respecting Catherine's need for private space. The arrangement worked well practically, but Catherine quickly discovered that private space had a very different meaning in a community where individual welfare was considered everyone's responsibility. The first cultural shock came on her second morning when Catherine emerged from her cabin to find 3 women sitting outside with coffee and what appeared to be handwork projects. They greeted her warmly and invited her to join them. But Catherine realized that what she had interpreted as coincidental gathering was actually a planned opportunity for the community's women to assess and welcome their potential new member. "I'm Maria Crow Feather," announced the oldest of the 3. A woman, perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked hair and hands that spoke of decades of skilled work. "I help coordinate our food preservation and distribution programs. This is Angela Horse Chief, who manages our children's education initiatives, and Rebecca 2 Eagles, who oversees our health and wellness programs." Catherine accepted coffee and settled onto a blanket spread on the ground, feeling simultaneously welcomed and evaluated. These women clearly held positions of responsibility within the community, and their interest in her was both personal and professional. "We understand you've developed considerable expertise in sustainable agriculture," Angela said without preamble. "Our current food production systems work well enough, but we're always interested in improvements that might increase our self-sufficiency." The conversation that followed revealed both the sophistication of the community's existing systems and the areas where Catherine's knowledge might prove valuable. The Lakota settlement had developed impressive capabilities in traditional crops and livestock management, but they struggled with year-round vegetable production and soil improvement techniques that could increase yields without requiring expensive external inputs. Catherine found herself energized by the technical discussions, describing permaculture principles and integrated growing systems that could enhance their current operations. But she also felt pressure to prove her usefulness immediately, rather than taking time to understand their existing methods before suggesting improvements. "Your enthusiasm is good," Rebecca 2 Eagles observed with a slight smile, "but you might want to watch and listen for a while before proposing changes. We've been feeding ourselves successfully for quite some time." The gentle correction stung, but Catherine recognized its wisdom. Her years of isolation had made her unaccustomed to collaboration and consensus building. She was used to implementing solutions immediately when she identified problems, but community life required patience and diplomatic relationship building that she had never learned. The afternoons of her first week were dedicated to individual time with each of her potential husbands, allowing her to explore personal compatibility while learning about their roles within the community. These encounters proved more complex and revealing than Catherine had anticipated. David Tallbear took her on walking tours of the settlement, pointing out features and explaining social dynamics with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely proud of his community. His knowledge was comprehensive and his explanations clear, but Catherine noticed that he seemed more interested in impressing her with the community's achievements than in learning about her perspectives and experiences. "We've maintained our language better than most communities," David explained as they visited the school where children were receiving instruction in both English and Lakota. "Our elders insisted that cultural preservation was essential for community survival, even when government policies encouraged assimilation." Catherine appreciated his cultural pride, but she also noticed that David's commentary rarely included questions about her thoughts or experiences. He seemed to assume that showcasing the community's strengths would naturally convince her to stay, rather than recognizing that successful partnership required mutual interest and genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives. Samuel Whitehawk approached their time together more systematically, focusing on practical aspects of community management and leadership responsibilities. He showed Catherine the renewable energy installations the community had developed, the water management systems that supported their agriculture, and the cooperative enterprises that provided economic sustainability. Effective leadership requires understanding all aspects of community operations, Samuel explained as they inspected solar panel installations that powered the school and community center. A leader's spouse needs to be prepared to contribute expertise in multiple areas, not just their primary specialization. Catherine found Samuel's competence impressive and his expectations reasonable, but she also sensed that he viewed their potential partnership primarily as a professional arrangement. His questions focused on her technical knowledge and management experience rather than her personal goals, fears, or hopes for the future. The approach felt efficient but emotionally distant. Marcus. Red Cloud organized their time around shared activities that revealed personality and compatibility through collaboration rather than formal conversation. They worked together in the community garden, cooked meals for elderly residents, and participated in children's educational activities that allowed Catherine to observe his interactions with different age groups. The best way to know someone is to work alongside them, Marcus explained as they weeded vegetable beds with a group of teenagers who were fulfilling community service requirements. Conversation can be misleading, but shared labor reveals character. Catherine appreciated Marcus's philosophy and found herself enjoying his company more than she had expected. He was genuinely interested in her opinions and experiences, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was listening carefully to her responses. But she also wondered if his easygoing nature might indicate lack of the strong leadership qualities that community challenges would require. Michael Thunder Horse took a completely different approach, focusing on the natural environment surrounding the community and traditional ecological knowledge that informed their land management practices. Their walks together were often silent, with Michael pointing out details of plant and animal behavior that demonstrated deep observation skills and environmental awareness. "The land teaches us everything we need to know about sustainable living," Michael said during a sunset walk along the river that bordered the settlement. "But most people have forgotten how to listen to what it's saying." Catherine felt genuine connection with Michael's environmental consciousness and was moved by his gentle, thoughtful approach to both human and natural relationships. But she also worried that his quiet nature might make him reluctant to engage in the kind of direct communication that partnership decisions would require. Thomas. Crow Eagles structured their time around discussions of community challenges and long-term planning that revealed the complexity of tribal leadership responsibilities. He shared information about federal policy changes affecting Native American communities, economic development opportunities that required careful evaluation, and cultural preservation initiatives that needed both traditional knowledge and contemporary advocacy skills. Leadership positions in our community require balancing multiple competing interests, Thomas explained, as they reviewed budget documents and grant applications that represented significant funding opportunities. We must serve our people's immediate needs, while also protecting long-term cultural and economic sustainability. Catherine found Thomas's intellectual approach stimulating and appreciated his willingness to share detailed information about community operations. But she also noticed that their conversations felt more like job interviews than romantic courtship, focusing on her qualifications rather than personal compatibility or emotional connection. By the end of her first week, Catherine felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the choice she was being asked to make. Each of the 5 men possessed qualities that would make him a valuable partner, but none of them had emerged as an obvious best choice. More troubling, Catherine was beginning to realize that her years of isolation had left her unprepared for the emotional and social demands of intimate partnership. The community itself presented similar complexity. Catherine was impressed by their achievements in cultural preservation, economic sustainability, and cooperative governance. But she was also struggling to adapt to constant social interaction, collective decision-making processes, and the absence of the privacy and autonomy that had defined her adult life. The breaking point came during her second week when Catherine attempted to implement improvements to the community garden without consulting the people responsible for its current management. Her suggestions were technically sound and potentially valuable, but her approach violated community norms about consultation and consensus building. "You're trying to fix problems that we haven't asked you to solve," Maria Crow Feather pointed out during a tense conversation about Catherine's unauthorized modifications to the composting system. Good ideas aren't useful if they're implemented without community support. The criticism hit Catherine harder than she had expected, forcing her to confront how deeply her isolation had shaped her approach to problem-solving. She was accustomed to identifying issues and implementing solutions immediately, but community life required patience, diplomacy, and collaborative processes that felt inefficient and frustrating. That evening, Catherine sat alone beside the river, questioning whether she possessed the temperament and skills necessary for successful community integration. The life she had built through individual competence and self-reliance seemed increasingly irrelevant to the collective challenges and opportunities she was being asked to embrace. Grandmother standing. Bear found her there as darkness settled over the valley, settling beside Catherine with the comfortable silence of someone who understood the weight of difficult transitions. "Your father struggled with similar feelings when he first returned to us after years in the outside world," the elderly woman said eventually. "He had learned to succeed as an individual, but he had to relearn how to succeed as part of a community." Catherine felt tears building behind her eyes as she contemplated the possibility that she might simply be incapable of the transformation everyone was expecting. "What if I can't do this? What if I'm too set in my ways to change?" "Change is like learning to ride a horse," Grandmother Standing Bear replied with a slight smile. "The first few times you fall off, but eventually you stop fighting the horse and start working with it. Community life is the same. You stop fighting against other people's needs and start finding ways to serve collective goals." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Grandmother Standing Bear sharing stories about community members who had struggled with similar transitions and eventually found their place within the collective structure. Her words provided comfort and perspective, but they also highlighted the magnitude of the personal transformation that successful integration would require. Over the following days, Catherine began approaching community life with greater humility and patience. Instead of immediately proposing solutions to problems she identified, she spent time observing existing systems and asking questions about their development and current effectiveness. Instead of working alone on projects that interested her, she sought opportunities to collaborate with community members on initiatives they had identified as priorities. The change in approach produced better results and more positive responses from community members. But it also required Catherine to constantly monitor her impulses toward independence and individual achievement. Every day brought multiple moments when she had to choose between efficient individual action and slower, collaborative processes. The personal aspects of her courtship also required adjustment to completely unfamiliar social dynamics. Catherine had never dated, never learned to navigate romantic relationships, never had to balance individual preferences with partnership considerations. The process of getting to know 5 potential husbands while being evaluated by an entire community felt simultaneously overwhelming and artificial. But gradually, Catherine began to see patterns in her interactions with the 5 men that suggested genuine compatibility with some and fundamental mismatches with others. David's enthusiasm remained appealing, but his lack of curiosity about her perspectives was becoming more problematic. Samuel's competence was impressive, but his emotional distance was troubling for someone seeking intimate partnership. Marcus continued to be easy company and genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences, while Michael's environmental consciousness and gentle nature felt increasingly compatible with her own values. Thomas's intellectual approach remained stimulating, but Catherine was beginning to question whether their interactions had sufficient emotional warmth to sustain a marriage. As her 3rd week in the community began, Catherine felt more confident about her ability to adapt to collective living while maintaining her individual identity. The challenges were real and ongoing, but they were manageable with patience and conscious effort. More importantly, she was beginning to see possibilities for contribution and fulfillment that individual success had never provided. The woman who had mastered the art of living alone was slowly learning that the art of living with others required different skills, but could provide rewards that solitary achievement could never match. The new world had different rules, but Catherine was beginning to understand that mastering those rules might lead to a more meaningful existence than she had ever imagined possible. The crisis that would test everything Catherine had learned about community life arrived without warning on a sweltering July morning during her 6th week with the Lakota band. She was working in the expanded community garden, training a group of teenagers in advanced composting techniques, when 8-year-old Jenny Little Wolf came running from the direction of the river, her face streaked with tears and her voice high with panic. "The water stopped!" Jenny gasped, pointing toward the irrigation channels that fed the agricultural areas. "All the ditches are empty, and my grandfather says the pump house is making bad noises." Catherine felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. The community's entire agricultural system depended on river water, distributed through a network of channels and smaller ditches that required constant flow to keep crops alive during the hot summer months. A pump failure during peak growing season could destroy months of work and threaten the community's food security for the entire winter. Racing toward the pump house with Jenny and the teenagers trailing behind her, Catherine could hear the irregular grinding sounds that suggested serious mechanical problems. Inside the small building that housed the community's water distribution equipment, she found Marcus Red Cloud and 2 other men standing helplessly beside machinery that was clearly beyond their technical expertise. "The main pump seized up about an hour ago," Marcus explained, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious worry. "We've got maybe 6 hours before the crops start showing serious stress, and 12 hours before we start losing plants permanently." Catherine studied the equipment with the systematic approach she had developed during years of maintaining her homestead's water systems. The pump was an older model, probably installed 15 years earlier, with wear patterns that suggested inadequate maintenance and lubrication. The motor showed signs of overheating, while the distribution manifold had developed leaks that indicated pressure problems throughout the system. "This isn't just a pump failure," Catherine diagnosed after examining the entire setup. "The whole system has been running inefficiently for months, maybe years. The pump has been working harder than it should because of back pressure from those leaks, and the motor finally couldn't handle the stress." The men listened to her analysis with growing concern. "Can you fix it?" Marcus asked bluntly. Catherine considered the question carefully. She had the technical knowledge to address the immediate problems, but repairs would require parts and equipment that might not be available locally. More importantly, she would be taking responsibility for the community's agricultural survival during the most critical period of the growing season. "I can try," she said finally, "but I'll need help, and I'll need authority to make decisions quickly without consulting everyone about every step." What followed was Catherine's first real test as a potential community leader. Over the next 18 hours, she coordinated a complex repair effort that demonstrated both her technical capabilities and her growing understanding of community dynamics. She sent teams to neighboring towns to locate replacement parts, organized shifts of workers to maintain emergency irrigation using buckets and garden hoses, and redesigned portions of the distribution system to improve long-term reliability. But more importantly, Catherine managed the crisis in ways that built community confidence rather than undermining it. Instead of working alone or demanding complete control, she explained her decisions to community members and incorporated their suggestions when appropriate. She acknowledged the expertise of others while maintaining clear direction for the overall effort. Thomas Crow Eagle proved invaluable during the crisis, using his leadership experience to coordinate resources and manage communications with tribal authorities who might provide emergency assistance. His ability to navigate political relationships complemented Catherine's technical skills, creating an effective partnership that impressed community observers. "You two work well together," Grandmother Standing Bear observed as she brought food to the exhausted repair crew during their second night of continuous work. Leadership requires both technical competence and political wisdom. Most people have one or the other, but rarely both. Samuel Whitehawk demonstrated his organizational abilities by managing the emergency irrigation efforts that kept crops alive, while Catherine worked on permanent repairs. His systematic approach to resource allocation and worker coordination showed the kind of practical leadership that would be essential for long-term community management. David Tall Bear contributed his natural ability to maintain morale during stressful situations, keeping workers motivated and optimistic despite the severity of the crisis. His jokes and stories made the exhausting work more bearable, while his genuine concern for community welfare helped maintain cooperation when tensions might otherwise have developed. Michael Thunder Horse proved surprisingly useful as a liaison with the horses and livestock that were also affected by the water system failure. His deep knowledge of animal behavior allowed him to manage emergency watering arrangements that kept community herds healthy during the crisis period. Marcus Red Cloud showed his adaptability by setting aside his own mechanical limitations and focusing on support roles that utilized his interpersonal skills. He coordinated meals for the work crews, managed childcare for families whose parents were involved in repairs, and handled communications with community members who weren't directly involved but needed regular updates. By the end of the second day, Catherine had successfully restored water flow to the agricultural areas and implemented system improvements that would prevent similar failures in the future. But the technical success was less important than the recognition she had earned from community members who had observed her leadership during genuine crisis. "You saved our harvest," Maria Crow Feather said simply as the community gathered to celebrate the restoration of their water system. But more than that, you showed us how individual expertise can serve collective needs without diminishing either. The validation felt different from anything Catherine had experienced during her years of solitary achievement. Her homestead successes had provided personal satisfaction, but community recognition carried emotional weight that individual accomplishment could never match. She had proven herself valuable not just as a technical expert, but as someone who could be trusted with responsibility for collective welfare. The water crisis also clarified Catherine's feelings about her potential husbands in ways that weeks of formal courtship had not achieved. Working alongside each man during emergency conditions had revealed aspects of their characters that casual interaction could not show. Thomas Crow Eagle's combination of political skill and genuine concern for community welfare impressed Catherine more than his previous formal presentations of leadership credentials. She appreciated his ability to support her technical decisions while contributing complementary expertise that made their collaboration more effective than either could have achieved alone. Samuel Whitehawk's organizational capabilities were undeniably valuable, but Catherine noticed that he seemed to view the crisis primarily as a management challenge rather than a threat to people and relationships he cared about deeply. His competence was impressive, but his emotional engagement felt limited. David Tallbear's contribution to morale had been genuine and important, but Catherine realized that his strengths lay in supporting other people's leadership rather than providing direction during difficult situations. He would make a wonderful community member, but perhaps not the kind of partner who could share the burdens of major decision-making. Michael Thunder. Horse's quiet competence and deep environmental knowledge had proven more valuable than Catherine had initially realized. His ability to manage complex logistics without drama or self-promotion suggested the kind of steady partnership that could sustain long-term collaboration. Marcus Redcloud's adaptability and interpersonal skills had been essential during the crisis, but Catherine found herself wishing he had shown more initiative in addressing the technical problems that threatened community welfare. She valued his supportiveness, but questioned whether he possessed the drive necessary for challenging leadership situations. 3 weeks after the water crisis, Catherine faced another test when a government inspector arrived to evaluate the community's compliance with federal environmental regulations. The visit had been scheduled months earlier, but Catherine's presence meant that she would be involved in presenting technical information about water management, waste disposal, and agricultural practices that could affect the community's eligibility for various federal programs. The inspector, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hayes, proved to be knowledgeable and fair, but demanding in her evaluation of community systems. Catherine found herself serving as the primary technical liaison, explaining permaculture principles, renewable energy installations, and integrated waste management approaches that went far beyond minimum regulatory requirements. "Your water management improvements are impressive," Dr. Hayes observed as Catherine guided her through the recently upgraded irrigation system. "These efficiency improvements actually exceed current best practice standards for tribal communities." Who designed these modifications? Catherine felt a moment of pride, followed immediately by recognition that her individual achievements were meaningful only within the context of community collaboration. The technical design was mine, but the implementation required expertise and labor from many community members. The systems work because everyone understands and supports them. The response seemed to impress Dr. Hayes, who made detailed notes about the community's integrated approach to environmental management. Her final report would note that the Lakota band had achieved sustainability standards that exceeded federal requirements while maintaining cultural traditions and economic viability. But The real recognition came from community members who had observed Catherine's professional performance during the inspection. Her ability to communicate technical concepts clearly while representing community values effectively had demonstrated another dimension of the leadership capabilities that marriage to a community elder would require. You spoke for us in ways that honored both our achievements and our limitations, Angela Horse Chief commented after Dr. Hayes departed. That kind of representation requires understanding community values well enough to translate them for outsiders who think differently than we do. The environmental inspection success led to invitations for Catherine to represent the community at regional gatherings where tribal leaders shared strategies for sustainable development and cultural preservation. Her first such appearance at a conference hosted by the Crow Nation provided external validation of her growing expertise in community-based sustainability. Dr. Susan Pretty Eagle, whom Catherine remembered from her early research into indigenous education models, approached her after Catherine's presentation about integrated water and agricultural systems. Your work with the Lakota band is gaining attention throughout the region, Dr. Pretty Eagle said. Communities are interested in adapting your approaches to their own circumstances. Have you considered developing formal training programs that could share these innovations more widely? Catherine felt excitement at the possibility of broader impact, but she also recognized that any expansion of her work would need to serve the interests of her adoptive community first. That's an interesting idea, but my primary commitment has to be to the people who gave me this opportunity to learn and contribute. The response demonstrated the kind of loyalty and priority setting that community leadership required. But it also showed Catherine's growing confidence in making decisions that balanced individual opportunities with collective responsibilities. As summer progressed into early autumn, Catherine found herself increasingly integrated into community decision-making processes and leadership responsibilities. Her technical expertise had provided the foundation for community acceptance, but her growing understanding of collaborative governance and cultural values had earned genuine respect from people whose approval could not be won through competence alone. The harvest season brought the final validation of Catherine's water system improvements. Crop yields exceeded previous years' production despite challenging weather conditions, while the improved efficiency of irrigation systems reduced labor requirements and water consumption simultaneously. More importantly, the agricultural success had been achieved through methods that enhanced, rather than compromised, traditional farming practices. Catherine had learned to integrate permaculture principles with indigenous agricultural knowledge, creating innovations that honored cultural values while improving practical outcomes. Standing in fields heavy with corn, beans, and squash that represented both individual achievement and collective success, Catherine realized that the testing period was essentially complete. She had proven her ability to contribute valuable expertise while adapting to community values and collaborative decision-making processes. The recognition she had earned was different from anything she had experienced during her years of solitary achievement. Individual success had provided personal satisfaction, but community validation carried emotional and spiritual dimensions that transformed not just how others saw her, but how she understood herself and her place in the world. The woman who had mastered the art of living alone had discovered that the art of living with others could provide fulfillment and purpose that individual achievement could never match. The testing was over, and Catherine had not only passed, but excelled in ways that opened possibilities for contribution and growth she had never imagined. But with recognition came the pressure to make final decisions about marriage and permanent community membership that would determine not just her own future, but the direction of leadership development for an entire community whose welfare now partly depended on her continued presence and expertise. The autumn equinox marked exactly 6 months since Catherine had left her Montana homestead to join the Lakota community. According to the agreement she had negotiated with Thomas Crow Eagle and his companions, this was the deadline for her final decision about permanent membership and marriage. As the date approached, Catherine found herself facing the most complex choice of her life with a clarity that surprised her. The woman who had struggled with community integration during her first weeks now moved through daily life with the confidence of someone who had found her place. Catherine's mornings began with collaborative planning sessions for the community's winter preparations. Her afternoons were spent implementing sustainability projects that served collective needs, and her evenings often included teaching sessions where she shared technical knowledge with community members eager to expand their capabilities. But the personal dimensions of her decision remained challenging. Catherine had developed genuine affection and respect for several of the men who had originally sought her hand in marriage. But she had also discovered that romantic compatibility required more than shared values and mutual respect. The process of choosing a life partner from among people who had become friends and colleagues felt both artificial and emotionally complex. The community council meeting that would formalize Catherine's decision was scheduled for the evening of the equinox. As the day dawned, clear and cool, with the kind of crystalline air that marked the transition from summer to autumn, Catherine walked alone to the river where she had first experienced doubt about her ability to adapt to collective living. Now, 6 months later, the same riverbank provided perspective on how profoundly her understanding of herself and her capabilities had evolved. The woman who had mastered solitary survival had discovered that her greatest achievements came through collaboration and service to purposes larger than individual success. Catherine's contemplation was interrupted by the approach of Grandmother Standing Bear, who moved with the deliberate grace of someone who understood the significance of important moments. The elderly woman settled beside Catherine on the rocky bank, her presence providing comfort without demanding conversation. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here," Grandmother Standing Bear said eventually. "Not just the technical contributions, but the way you've learned to balance individual competence with community responsibility." Catherine felt tears building behind her eyes as she considered the legacy of a father she had never known, but whose influence had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Do you think I'm making the right choice by staying?" "I think you're making the choice that honors both your individual gifts and your responsibility to people who have come to depend on those gifts," the elderly woman replied. "That's all anyone can do." The conversation that followed helped Catherine articulate feelings she had been struggling to express even to herself. Her decision to remain with the community permanently was based on more than professional satisfaction or romantic attraction. She had discovered that belonging to something larger than herself provided meaning and purpose that individual achievement could never match. But Catherine had also reached clarity about the marriage question that had initially seemed so overwhelming. During the crisis periods, when she had worked most closely with each potential husband, genuine compatibility had emerged through shared challenges rather than formal courtship rituals. Thomas Crow Eagle remained impressive as a leader and collaborator, but their interactions felt more professional than romantic. Catherine respected his intelligence and dedication, but she couldn't imagine the kind of intimate partnership that marriage required developing between them. Samuel Whitehawk's organizational capabilities complemented her technical skills effectively, but Catherine had come to recognize that his emotional reserve would make him a difficult partner for someone who was still learning to navigate intimate relationships. She needed someone whose warmth and openness would help her continue developing interpersonal skills. David Tallbear's enthusiasm and humor made him delightful company, but Catherine had observed that he preferred supporting other people's leadership to taking initiative himself. While his qualities would make him a wonderful friend, she questioned whether their partnership would provide the mutual challenge and growth that successful marriage required. Marcus Red Cloud, had proven himself adaptable and supportive in ways that Catherine valued. But she had gradually realized that his easygoing nature might indicate lack of the passionate commitment to shared goals that she needed in a life partner. Their relationship felt comfortable but not transformative. Michael Thunderhorse had emerged as the most compatible potential partner through a combination of shared environmental values, complementary skills, and emotional connection that had developed naturally through their collaboration. His quiet strength balanced Catherine's more intense approach to problem-solving, while his deep knowledge of traditional ecological practices enhanced her technical expertise in sustainable systems. More importantly, Catherine had observed that Michael possessed the kind of steady commitment to community welfare that matched her own evolving sense of purpose. Their conversations revealed shared dreams about expanding the community's sustainability initiatives and developing models that could serve other indigenous communities facing similar challenges. As afternoon moved toward evening, Catherine made her final preparations for the council meeting that would formalize her decisions about permanent membership and marriage. She had spent considerable time crafting her presentation, wanting to express not just her choices but her understanding of what those choices meant for both her own future and the community's development. The council meeting took place in the large community center where Catherine had first met Grandmother Standing Bear 6 months earlier. But now, instead of feeling like an outsider seeking acceptance, Catherine experienced the gathering as a celebration of achievements earned through months of dedicated service and successful integration. As Thomas Crow Eagle opened the meeting by reviewing Catherine's contributions to community welfare since her arrival. The list was impressive. Water system improvements that had saved the harvest, environmental compliance achievements that secured federal funding, regional recognition that brought positive attention to community innovations, and training programs that had enhanced multiple community members' technical capabilities. Catherine Miller has proven herself valuable not just as an individual contributor, but as someone who enhances our collective capabilities, Thomas concluded. Her presence has made our entire community stronger and more capable. The formal invitation for Catherine to speak about her decision created a moment of nervous anticipation that reminded her of her first day in the community. But now, instead of feeling intimidated by collective attention, Catherine experienced the gathering as an opportunity to express gratitude for experiences that had transformed her understanding of what meaningful life could include. 6 months ago, I came here as someone who had mastered the art of living alone, Catherine began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. I thought independence and self-sufficiency were the highest achievements possible, but you've taught me that individual competence only becomes meaningful when it serves purposes larger than personal survival. Catherine's presentation continued for nearly 30 minutes, describing her journey from isolation to integration, while acknowledging the challenges and growth that community membership required. She spoke about discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed and finding fulfillment through collaboration that exceeded anything individual achievement had provided. I want to remain here permanently, Catherine declared, her words carrying across the silent gathering with the weight of formal commitment. I want to continue contributing to this community's welfare and helping develop models for sustainability that can serve other indigenous communities facing similar challenges. The announcement was met with applause and expressions of satisfaction that felt genuine rather than merely polite. Catherine had earned her place through demonstrated contribution rather than charity or accommodation, and community members seemed pleased to formalize her permanent membership. But the more personal announcement created even greater emotional resonance. I also want to accept Michael Thunderhorse's proposal of marriage, Catherine continued, her voice softening as she looked toward the man who had become her closest collaborator and dearest friend. Our partnership has developed through shared work and mutual respect into something that I believe can provide the foundation for a lifetime of collaboration and growth. The approval that greeted this announcement felt different from the professional recognition she had received. Catherine realized that the community had been observing her developing relationship with Michael and had concluded that their compatibility would serve not just personal happiness, but collective welfare as well. Michael's response was characteristically quiet but deeply felt. "Catherine has taught me that partnership means more than sharing daily life," he said, standing to address the gathering. "It means challenging each other to become better people while working together toward goals neither of us could achieve alone." The marriage ceremony took place 3 weeks later, during the harvest celebration that marked the community's most important annual gathering. Catherine had requested a blend of traditional Lakota customs and contemporary elements that honored both her heritage and her personal journey toward cultural integration. The ceremony itself was beautiful and meaningful, but Catherine found herself most moved by the integration of her personal transformation with community celebration. Her individual achievement in finding love and partnership was meaningful precisely because it served collective purposes and strengthened community bonds. The months that followed brought new challenges and opportunities that tested Catherine and Michael's partnership while demonstrating the value of their collaboration. Winter preparations required complex coordination of resources and labor that drew on both their technical expertise and their growing understanding of community leadership responsibilities. Catherine's work expanded beyond local sustainability projects to include consultation with other tribal communities seeking to implement similar innovations. Her reputation had grown sufficiently that requests for assistance came from indigenous communities throughout the region, creating opportunities for broader impact while maintaining her primary commitment to her adoptive home. Michael proved to be an ideal partner for this expanded role, providing the cultural knowledge and relationship-building skills that complemented Catherine's technical expertise. Their joint presentations at regional gatherings demonstrated the kind of effective collaboration that made their individual contributions more valuable than either could have achieved alone. By spring, Catherine and Michael had developed preliminary plans for establishing a demonstration center that would showcase sustainable living practices adaptable to reservation conditions. The project would serve their own community while providing training opportunities for other indigenous communities interested in achieving greater self-sufficiency. The proposal had gained support from tribal authorities and attracted interest from federal agencies seeking to fund innovative approaches to rural development. Catherine's individual expertise had provided the foundation for opportunities that could benefit indigenous communities throughout the region. Standing in her expanded garden on the first anniversary of her arrival, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate isolation to meaningful integration. The woman who had been alone since childhood had discovered that her greatest achievements came through partnership and service to purposes larger than individual survival. The technical skills that had sustained her through years of solitary living had become tools for community empowerment and cultural preservation. The independence that had once defined her identity had evolved into the kind of leadership that strengthened collective capabilities while honoring individual contributions. Michael joined her in the garden as evening light painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their daily tradition of sharing observations about plant growth and seasonal changes had become a meditation on the cycles of growth and renewal that characterized both natural systems and human communities. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of living alone?" Michael asked, studying tomato plants that were thriving under Catherine's careful attention. Catherine considered the question seriously, thinking about the satisfactions of solitary achievement compared to the complexities of partnership and community responsibility. "I miss the efficiency sometimes," she admitted. "Individual decisions were faster and easier. But I don't miss the limitations. Everything I can accomplish now is bigger and more meaningful than anything I achieved alone." The conversation continued as they completed their evening garden maintenance, discussing plans for expanding food production capabilities and sharing techniques with other communities. Their partnership had evolved into the kind of collaborative relationship that enhanced both individual capabilities and collective welfare. As autumn approached again, marking 2 full years since Catherine's first departure from her Montana homestead, she received a letter that would test her integration in unexpected ways. The message came from Bill Patterson, the neighbor who had been checking on her abandoned property, informing her that development pressure was threatening the area and her. Homestead might need to be sold unless she returned to manage it personally. The news created the first serious challenge to Catherine's commitment to permanent community membership. Her homestead represented 8 years of individual achievement and the foundation of everything she had learned about sustainable living. Losing it would mean abandoning not just property, but the roots of her identity as someone who had survived and thrived through individual competence. But Catherine's response to the crisis demonstrated how profoundly her priorities had shifted during her 2 years of community integration. Instead of immediately planning to return to Montana, she began exploring ways to preserve her homestead's value while maintaining her commitment to the Lakota community that had become her true home. Michael proved instrumental in developing a solution that honored both Catherine's individual history and their shared commitment to community welfare. Working with tribal authorities and federal agencies, they developed a proposal to establish Catherine's homestead as a satellite demonstration site connected to their main community projects. The arrangement would allow Catherine to maintain her Montana property while using it to showcase sustainable living practices that could inspire other rural communities. The homestead would become part of a network of demonstration sites that extended their community's influence while preserving the foundation of Catherine's individual achievements. The solution satisfied Catherine's need to honor her personal history while demonstrating her complete commitment to the collaborative future she had chosen. Her individual competence had evolved into a tool for community empowerment that could serve indigenous communities throughout the region. Standing once again beside the river where she had first questioned her ability to adapt to collective living, Catherine marveled at how completely her understanding of success and fulfillment had transformed. The woman who had been alone since childhood had discovered that her greatest achievements came through partnership, collaboration, and service to purposes larger than individual survival. The fire that had burned within her during years of isolation had not been extinguished by community integration. Instead, it had become a flame that warmed and illuminated not just her own life, but the lives of everyone. Touched by the sustainable communities and innovative partnerships she and Michael were building together, Catherine Miller had found her way home, not by returning to the place she came from, but by helping to create a world where belonging and individual excellence could flourish together, where the art of living alone had become the foundation for mastering the infinitely more rewarding art of living with others in service to the future they were building together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.